Okay, thank you very much for coming. This is the first time, by the way, at a conference that I've had to wear glasses, so you might have to bear with me as I kind of like swap between looking at my computer and looking at the screen and so on, but anyway, that's what happens when you get old. So, my name is Bradley Crooks. I look after digital entertainment and games at BBC Studios, and for you, those of you that aren't familiar with BBC Studios, and I promise not to show too many slides like this, BBC Studios is the part of the BBC that is particularly interested in the commercialisation of BBC IP. So a couple of years ago, the part of the BBC that looked after internal production, so the production units that look after things like sort of Doctor Who, Top Gear and so on, was taken off as a kind of separate entity. And then this year, in April, that was merged with the part of the BBC called BBC Worldwide, both of those now called BBC Studios, confusingly. But really, though that entity now kind of looks after, within the BBC, IP generation, all the production that the BBC does internally, and also sales and distribution for the BBC on an international level. So we create and invest in kind of high quality content across all our genres, but particularly in the factual, drama and entertainment area. We work with production companies internal at the BBC, so we have kind of production companies in London, in Manchester, in Cardiff for Doctor Who, but also especially with third-party production companies as well. And we also invest in those companies, so that's something that the BBC has been doing more of in the last 5 to 10 years, is investing in TV production companies as well, and that's partly about sort of supporting the TV industry in the UK, but it's also about some other things which I'll come on to talk about. And now we're starting to invest at investing outside of TV production as well, which is one of the things that I'll talk about later. So BBC Studios has a wide range of kind of IP. Some of these will be kind of familiar with you. Maybe some of them won't be as familiar. And most of this IP is TV IP. Most. And that's, again, something which is important to the BBC. I would say you should be able to pick out a couple of brands on there which maybe you'll notice aren't directly from kind of TV. And this is something, again, that the BBC is investing in over the next few years. So we have a number of channels. A lot of these channels are kind of international channels. So BBC America, BBC Canada, BBC Brit are all channels that you wouldn't necessarily get here, but it's a big part of our business overseas. And traditionally, that's where the business comes from for kind of like BBC sales for worldwide is overseas sales. And the money that we generate through BBC sort of IP sales goes back into subsidising the licence fee in the UK. So how do we think about content at the BBC? So this is an interesting question, and you'll each have your own way of kind of like dealing with kind of the different kind of like formats, the different kind of ways of categorizing content. But at the moment, at least, this is the way that we kind of look at the different kind of like formats. So on one end, you've got kind of long form. That's what we call kind of traditional TV programming. That's the type of stuff that goes out on terrestrial TV, goes out kind of on Netflix, that type of thing. Short form, increasingly, kind of younger audience are interested in kind of short form video content. That's the type of thing that you might kind of see on kind of YouTube Red, that type of thing. 15 minutes, often less, sometimes even only sort of 3 or 4 minutes. Content which is basically not got the long format. And then all the way across through to kind of like kind of merchandise even, and we do look at that as a kind of like a vertical in the same way that we look at, say, 360 in short form. And these areas in the middle, kind of 360, VR, AR, and to some extent, games, are what we might call kind of like new formats to us. They're not what you would call traditional business for the BBC or any broadcaster for that matter. So that landscape begins to get kind of a little bit more complicated when you look at it from another angle. So, in terms of kind of like, audio content, you can deliver audio content in lots of different ways. Within each of these verticals, there are lots of different ways of looking at kind of content. So obviously within VR, you've got kind of mobile VR, you've got kind of real-time VR, you've got interactive 360, which is increasingly sort of being popular. And then you've got the distribution methods. So you can begin to see that you have this very kind of complicated landscape. And that's one which I think kind of most big broadcasters, most IP owners struggle with in terms of kind of like how to approach it. But the way that we fundamentally look at this is we can forget all of those kind of like, different sort of ways of approaching it and look at it like this, that essentially what the BBC is about storytelling and it's about brand. And I think, when you sort of distill everything down in that way, then you sort of approach things in a slightly different sort of way. And to us, that's what we're always trying to do with all our content. And I've added voice in there as a kind of like an area that we've just started focusing on quite a lot. And it's equally true for voice and in a way for merchandise as well, in terms of kind of way we represent our brand and the way that we tell stories with our brands. So we see kind of new formats really as the building blocks for our IPs and longer term for franchises as well. And the reason that we see them as building blocks and really the kind of like the future is because the landscape for the TV industry is radically changing, and you'll all have heard of kind of sort of people, especially younger audiences, kind of leaving TV to kind of look at kind of other forms of kind of entertainment. And this is some Ofcom figures for last year. They're about to bring out kind of 2017 figures. But you can see that the kind of like the way that we kind of get, the BBC gets kind of income is decreasing over time from the allocated sort of revenue that's coming from TV. And so what does that mean? It means that we have to find our audiences elsewhere. So here's a little game for you. Anyone guess the average age of a BBC One viewer? 61. That's the average age of someone that watches BBC One. The time that 16 to 24-year-olds spend on their game consoles for watching TV, 2 to 1. So they spend twice as much time playing games on their consoles as they do watching TV on their consoles. That's an amazing figure. Okay, and the average viewing time, and this is, I think, interesting. So TV isn't dead, by the way. Is still 3.5 hours per day on average in the UK household. And that's quite a stunning figure when you think about it. Now, it's much, much lower, by the way, for that 16 to 24-year-old kind of like age group. It's probably about a third of that. But still, 91% of people in the UK still have some form of interaction with their TV, and it's still the main go-to device in terms of consuming entertainment in the UK, and I think will continue to be for some time. But obviously, from our point of view, in terms of kind of like building a long-term sort of revenue stream, we have to kind of bear this in mind and go where the kind of audiences are going. So that means we have to change the way that we approach the delivery of our content. So, talking about new things, we have a new Doctor this year. And we also have a new approach to the way that we are dealing with the franchise for Doctor Who. So our franchise is already built on multiple channels. I mean, this is something that's been happening over the last sort of 10 to 12 years with Doctor Who. And those of you that are familiar with the brand will know that outside of the TV series, there are lots of different ways to get content around Doctor Who. And the reason we've been doing that is to kind of chase and to build those audiences that are kind of leaving TV, especially the younger audiences that are our future audiences, obviously. And it also allows us to tell stories outside of TV. And that's a key thing for us, is the change in the approach so that we're not entirely led from the TV series point of view. If you look at most TV companies, they consider their kind of TV kind of like main kind of series as the starting point, and everything comes from that. And running a franchise is different to that. You have to think of it in terms of all the different verticals, the different ways of reaching your audiences, and not one particular kind of vertical leading everything else. And this is a big change, especially for somewhere like the BBC, which is very used to working in a certain way. So as I mentioned, we already have these kind of like consumer touch points. We have a kind of TV, a SVOD business. So that's, subscription video on demand, so you can get Doctor Who on kind of Netflix and kind of other subscription services all throughout the world. We do lots of stuff in terms of events and cinema. We have kind of like a big DVD sale, obviously, licensing, publishing, and finally gaming. So at the moment, we have, I would say, dallied in a little bit of console work. We did some work with kind of Lego Dimensions. We have done some mobile gaming around Doctor Who as well. But we really need to be embracing in kind of like these other fields, AR, VR, voice, etc., to be able to reach those audiences, to engage with those audiences, both the existing ones in terms of kind of like giving them a way to kind of engage with the Doctor Who brand, but also in terms of kind of like reaching new audiences as well, because those new audiences are not coming from TV. You know, that aging TV kind of market is not going to be sort of delivering us kind of incremental kind of growth in the franchise. But we have a strong kind of layer to start with in terms of our kind of like engagement with Doctor Who fans. So we've got 110 million monthly impressions on Facebook and Twitter last year. We have, you know, a lot of, you know, 5.5 million fans on kind of like on Facebook and so on. So it's a great place to start. But again, that's kind of like one channel. They're not kind of necessarily consuming large amounts of kind of content. They're not kind of engaging at a deep level with the brand. And that's what we see games and other kind of like interactive story formats being able to deliver for us. So we have, as I say, we've done some things kind of in kind of what I would say are kind of new storytelling formats. We did an AI for Skybot for Doctor Who. We did a little bit of mucking around with kind of some AR on kind of like Facebook with Facebook masks. And we've got a new game coming out actually, which is called Doctor Who Infinity. And this is specifically aimed at kind of like the core fans for Doctor Who. And the idea here is that we got the production team to allow us to go and tell some original stories that are going to effectively form part of the canon of Doctor Who. And I cannot tell you how big a deal that is from a Doctor Who point of view. Being able to actually sort of have a conversation with the kind of showrunners to say, you know, it's not going to be the TV series which is kind of leading in an area. That's a big deal. So for us, it's the first step in terms of being able to deliver content on the brand from another part of the kind of like, you know, the sort of the editorial kind of like writing team that isn't TV based. So this will come out in August. There are kind of like, I think 5 episodes to begin with. It's kind of quirky. It's got original voice acting from previous cast members, and the writers and the artists are all from the kind of like the actual original kind of like production team as well. So that's going to be really exciting. We've also just announced at E3 a partnership with a company called Eline Productions, Eline Media. They brought out a game a few years ago, you might remember, called Never Alone. And this is their new game called Beyond Blue, where we're going to be using Blue Planet 2 kind of footage to support what is called an impact game. Never Alone was about the the Inuit culture, and you sort of played through this kind of game with a little girl and her snow fox, I think it was. It's a similar type of idea, but we're helping to support kind of storytelling through the content that we deliver through Blue Planet 2. Okay, so let's look at VR a little bit, and in particular about one of the products that we've worked on kind of recently. So we've done quite a lot of sort of tests, I would say, in kind of like VR. There's quite a lot of sort of VR happening at the BBC. As with everything else at the BBC, there's lots of different parts of the BBC doing lots of different things all at the same time. So we have something called VR Hub, which is in the public service part of the BBC, and my team is also doing a fair amount of kind of VR as well within BBC Studios. Some of this you might have seen, some of it not. We did some stuff with Oculus called Oogie: A Beetle's Journey, which was a game. Again, it's all true to the natural history. So, you know, that's really important. So we're kind of telling the story of the Oog piece to Beetle, but through a game. And that's also something that we did with Life in VR, which came out earlier in the year. I'd like to play you just a kind of short clip about some of the things that went into making Life in VR, and then I can talk a little bit about kind of the impact for that within the BBC.
Life in VR is a new form of virtual reality which the BBC have been working on and developing.
It allows you to meet sea otters, officially the furriest animals in the world, and that's the beginning of the journey. So you begin to meet Humboldt squid and krill and sperm whale and white sharks and blue sharks and a whole host of characters.
We have actually done a lot of research with the scientists on the west coast of America to make sure that this film is absolutely accurate.
The authenticity of proportions of creatures, their behaviour, how they react to one another was really important for this piece. For the motion, and to create this active natural experience, the creatures were going to need to have some AI. So for example, the sea otter understands that the player is there, it will react to you. Using the network of these kind of nav handles, you can go off the beaten track and explore further and deeper into the kelp forest in Chapter 1, for example. Music, sound effects, such an important role in VR. The ability to be able to hear a creature coming up behind you and then going past you on, say, on your right and in front of you, it really draws people's attention. Another solution that we did for music was to create a dynamic audio engine. So basically we could paint regions and areas actually in Photoshop and show where different music was going to fade in and out. So that meant you had a continuous soundscape.
I don't know that this has ever been done before on mobile devices. I would really hope that people...
Enough of him, anyway. So, I hate seeing myself on TV. What I wanted to talk about here, really, though, was what actually went into, we think, kind of making this a kind of credible piece of work from a storytelling point of view. So, we actually started the discussion about creating this piece of content 2.5 years ago. It took us such a long time for lots of different reasons, some of which I'll sort of touch on, to get this kind of like through the BBC. We did exhaustive research, and obviously there's a lot of kind of like this kind of sort of research and content that exists within the BBC already in kind of our archives, and obviously a lot of this kind of information was sort of based around some of our landmark series that we'd done already. But actually the way that it took us to kind of like bring that all together and put it into a kind of like VR experience, we couldn't really have imagined how kind of complex that was before we started. And that's partly because we want to tell the story properly, we want to kind of educate and entertain you, but we want the science to be correct as well. And fitting all those things into a 15-minute experience was really, really tricky. So we had some subject matter experts from the kind of natural history unit working on this. I think we were in pre-production for about 6 or 7 months before we actually went into kind of to create the experience. We were working with a company called Preloaded in London, who are a great developer, did a fantastic job on this. But we had started with what we thought was a fairly kind of like sensible approach, as a fairly kind of linear script that kind of led us through. And of course, when we got into kind of like, you know, actually trying it out, and we realized that people could more or less go wherever they wanted, that in VR, it's actually really difficult to get people to take on information if they're listening to a voiceover at the same time as doing something. Much more so than you would have, say, on a 2D kind of experience. All of these things meant that we had to kind of iterate over a kind of a number of attempts to get something that kind of would work. I think the kind of end result kind of was really good, but it took us a long time to get there. Hopefully that learning will set us up well for the future. But it took resources from all sorts of different parts of the BBC, and it took a kind of change in the way that we approach things. So we learnt quite a few things out of this. It isn't cheap to create good VR, and I'm sure some of you know this yourselves, and this is probably true of most kind of like new formats, right? The amount of time that you need to invest to get something that works is usually 2 or 3 times more than you imagine it would be. It took a lot longer than we were expecting. So we had originally, I think, said we would have a kind of 9-month production schedule, including pre-production, and it was probably about 15 to 18 months in total. Probably one of the biggest things is we needed to change the way that we did things internally. So a company like the BBC has kind of internal processes, the way that we kind of bring kind of content through our kind of channels to market is kind of fairly, you know, set over kind of many years of kind of working in sort of TV distribution and so on. But this sort of sat outside of it. And the problem is that when you're dealing with something like kind of like VR, for some reason games are seen as kind of different. They're fine, you get them on a console and it's kind of like different. But VR kind of captured the imagination of a lot of people at the kind of at the BBC. Mainly because there's kind of 360 content on there as well, and that's very close obviously to kind of like TV production. But this suddenly got the kind of like the interest, and it, you know, one of the reasons it took us so long is that we were halfway through the process, and kind of the brand director said, "Oh blimey, is this going to go out to, you know, sort of people all over the world?" Sounds crazy. She hadn't thought of that before, but you know, so we had to go through this kind of like new process of kind of like sign-offs and approvals internally. We need to make sure that the kind of like editorial team were all on board. So that really did kind of like, completely sort of change the way that we approach things. And there are unexpected consequences as well. One of those being that now we have raised our head above the parapet internally at the BBC, which is kind of a good thing and a bad thing. So on the one hand, it's been great for the profile of kind of interactive experiences and kind of like my team in general in terms of kind of creating those experiences. But also there are kind of now expectations in the way that we're going to do future work as well. So, we can't sort of get away with doing things below the radar kind of anymore. And we also now need to invest, if we're going to be doing more on this, in terms of kind of like how our different production units kind of like understand this area as well. So they're all looking at basically taking in kind of new skills to be able to, and tools as well, to be able to kind of author content, understand the kind of like production process and ultimately where it's going to end up. So outside of VR, we're also doing some other kind of interesting new format work at the BBC. You might be familiar with some of these different kind of departments within the BBC, but I wanted to kind of look at one in particular, which is what we're doing in the news area. So there are lots of different ways of approaching kind of like news delivery these days. And again, like kind of like general kind of content from a broadcast point of view, the way to reach kind of younger audiences in particular has changed hugely. So there are lots of kind of like different kind of like methods for kind of people to kind of access their news these days. And we've just conducted some research, especially with the kind of younger age group, I think 16 to 24, in terms of what they like to sort of, how they like to kind of access their content. And I think it came up with some fairly kind of interesting kind of answers actually. So one of those was that, because the traditional way of kind of delivering kind of news is in this kind of 300 to 800 kind of like word kind of like article kind of format. That's been the case for donkey's years. But this research showed that most younger audiences like to do what they call skim and big. So that is, they like to be able to see everything in the news, but they just want to see kind of like the highlights. And then they want to be able to dig down into those different kind of sections of the news in an interactive way to be able to kind of like get the kind of detail. And so what they really want to do is they want to see everything wide and then kind of delve down into detail later. But one of the most surprising things in addition to that I sort of found from this research was that they also expect interactions in their news. And this is driven by social media and also gaming. So rather than just see it in kind of like, a plain kind of like format, they want to kind of interact with that content in some way. And I can give you a few examples of some stuff that we're doing within the kind of like BBC News team to kind of to show kind of how that might work. So this is just some kind of like some tech tests that we've been doing with that age group to try out a few different ways of delivering kind of news content. So this is the idea that basically there's a kind of a more kind of interactive format. By the way, this is all probably going to be delivered via mobile. It could be delivered on the web as well, but this format is kind of specifically designed for mobile. And this is the idea that you can give kind of like people that kind of top line, but then you can give them the ability to kind of like have kind of more interactions as they wish, as they kind of like go through that content. So that's one. So this is a kind of basically kind of an expandable kind of news option. So again, younger kind of audiences, again, they like to kind of like understand the context of things kind of more because they have a kind of very broad understanding but not a deep understanding. We wanted to trial out this ability of kind of like not taking for granted that they knew everything and expanding on kind of each of the different areas so that they can give kind of like extra context. And finally, and this is the most gamified, I think, of them all, was this idea. This is the Tinder of news delivery. Or maybe it's not, actually. Maybe that's typical. Not that I know how Tinder works, by the way. So this is an idea where essentially you're kind of like, you're building up in an interactive way kind of chunks of kind of like news information. So you can swipe right, I think, for for a piece of content that you want, and swipe left for content that you don't want. And at the end of that kind of process, then you have kind of like a kind of a build-up of that content to then be able to consume in more depth. So all of these things have actually trialled fairly well. I mean, we're not obviously going to put all of these out, but it just goes to show that there are kind of like, there's quite a lot of change happening even within things like areas like news, which has kind of traditionally been kind of very, very sort of traditional in the way it delivered its content in the past. So voice is another area that the BBC is kind of investing in heavily. And I think we're currently the leading news provider on Alexa, Siri, and Google for kind of news. And I think we have like something like 3 or 4 million users each week listening at the moment on the Alexa skill. So it's sort of nascent, but it's getting there. In particular, we're kind of interested in looking at voice from the opportunity that it gives for kind of children's content. So, voice is a great way of having kids interact. It's a very easy way for them to kind of interact. And that's an opportunity that we think can be great for both kind of gaming, but other forms of kind of content delivery as well. And then finally, I wanted to talk about something which is, I think, most relevant to this kind of group, which is a new initiative that my team is starting called Gaming First. So within kind of the BBC, obviously as a kind of a company that's traditionally been led from a TV point of view, gaming has always been something kind of off on the side. But now with that kind of new approach to kind of like building franchises, it's seen as a core way of delivering new audience, and engaging with existing audiences for our big franchises. So we're now looking at an initiative called Gaming First, and there's kind of 3 parts to this. The first is having gaming-led content. So that example I gave before for Doctor Who Infinity is sort of would fit into this category. So it's taking content around our major brands and delivering kind of gaming experiences that essentially form part of the canon. So it's not led from the TV series, it's originated from a game first. The second is to develop new IP from people like yourselves into franchises. So we're interested in talking to developers and publishers about taking non-TV IP, gaming IP or interactive IP, and building that backwards, if you like, into kind of bigger franchises through the BBC. And the final one is game developer investment. And that's something I touched on at the beginning, which is the BBC has been investing in TV production, but is now looking outside of TV production to directly invest in developers as well. And that's something that we're interested in talking to you about as well. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions? Any questions at all? Yeah.
How do you manage the audio situation in which, say, you have a cue that a creature is about to pass you on the right, or is it passing you to the right, with when the user is deaf?
Accessibility is a really good question. I'd say it's something that we're kind of looking at with our R&D department at the BBC. You mean specifically for VR or in general?
VR specifically, but in general.
The BBC has a kind of like a remit for accessibility and is doing quite a lot in that sort of latter area. In VR, it's a good question. We've looked at kind of like we have got in Life in VR, we've got kind of visual cues as well. But it's definitely a good question, something that we need to kind of like probably be sort of focusing more time on. We went to Games for Change with Life in VR a couple of weeks ago, and from a kind of content point of view and bringing kind of educational content through, I think it was really interesting. But seeing some of the other games there and what they're doing from an accessibility point of view was a real eye opener. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Okay. Yes.
Firstly, great talk. Secondly, love the VR content you've been doing and some of the stuff for. Thanks. Kids and VR.
Yeah.
what are the BBC's thoughts on this, and what are your... I'm a parent. I have 2 young kids. Obviously, I'm told, no, don't give them VR. That's going to destroy their lives. However, they love it. And
I know this question very well.
Oh, please.
I've got kids myself, and it's a tough one. Currently, we are going with the 13 lower age limit guidelines. Personally, I think that that's something that will be reviewed, but it's the BBC, and we want to be very careful about kind of how we approach this. So our guidelines at the moment would be we're not aiming any content for viewers below 13. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question, great talk as well. Good job. One of the things I wanted to ask is about giving your audience choice. So that kind of Tinder example you used there. How do you... I shouldn't have said that, should I? I'm going to remember it from now on.
BBC pushes Tinder. No, I'm not.
How do you ensure that content that you produce isn't wasted if viewers don't use it, or giving them a choice between what they see and what they don't?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I think is true of a lot of kind of interactive content in general. I mean, the games industry has this, with sort of branching narratives and so on. How do you make sure that your effort kind of don't go to waste? I think a lot of it is to do with the tools in which you use to kind of deliver that content and curate that content. So, if you have that information already and you have a kind of a good set of tools and an efficient process for kind of bringing that to the user's attention, then hopefully you're covering kind of all your bases in that someone will be kind of viewing that content. It's content that you would otherwise be using. You're not generating all of that, by spending 5 times as much sort of time kind of creating it in the first place. So I think kind of tools and process are kind of key to making that work.
So then, if, for example, in that example that you used, if a player, for example, misses a piece of content, so they've decided to kind of flick over it, and then it's introduced or alluded to later on, how can you ensure that they understand or have an understanding of what's been shown later? Of
the context of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, that it's partly about, having some sort of kind of dynamic kind of understanding in terms of the kind of analytics, what people are doing. I guess, you can look at what other people are doing and kind of allow some context in terms of the content with regards to that. So, if other similar people with similar kind of taste going through the same kind of, process do one thing and someone doesn't, then you can maybe kind of give them some cues to kind of go back to that content. So, but this is what the R&D team are spending a lot of their time trying to work out is, the best way to kind of give people access to news content or any content kind of in the way that suits them.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.